You are listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. This podcast contains material of a disturbing and often graphic nature. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, welcome friends. This is Annie.
And this is Johanna, and thanks for joining us today.
We know you have a lot of options when it comes to choosing your source of terrible, terrible things. So thank you for listening to the Fresh Hell podcast.
Well, that's Fresh Hell. Your best source for internationale Schauergeschichten.
Gesundheit. No, serious. What was that?
That's how you say international horror in German. Internationale Schauergeschichten.
That's awesome. I had a really super nice boyfriend in college, and he was from Germany. Hey, Horst. Horst, super German name, right? But he taught me some German, and all I really remember is Ja genau, 5, ich weiß nicht.
Okay, we'll work on that.
We must. He was a good teacher, and I feel like I really let him down. I only remember, there's a few words, a couple more, but I don't think any of them actually make a sentence. I don't think I could actually speak a sentence. Yeah, he was still is a super nice guy. We're still friends. But his middle name was Wolfgang, and I always thought, is that the most badass German name? I really feel like there aren't enough Wolfgangs in the world. Amadeus feels pretentious, but I like Wolfgang.
Wolfgang is actually a pretty common name around here, and it means Path of the Wolf.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it is actually pretty badass now that I think about it. And please don't name your kid Amadeus. Although, actually, we do love us some Mozart here in Vienna.
Yeah, well, of course you would. I mean, that's one of the things I want to see when we come to see you. But we listened to Mozart a lot in my house as a kid, thanks to my dad. I'm going to have to practice when we come to see you. So wait, German in Germany, though, is different from German in Austria, yeah?
Yeah, it actually is. I've been told that Austrian German sounds a little bit more melodic. You remember I was living in Mexico, right? And I used to have a colleague from Berlin. One time, our Mexican colleagues came to me and asked me why I sound like I'm chanting, and the girl from Berlin actually sounded like she wanted to start a war. And here in Vienna, actually, we love to talk a little bit with a nasal voice.
All right.
But enough with that. So, Annie, actually, what fresh hell do you have for us today? Is it murder, mystery?
Well, today I'm going to tell you about a murder. It's a pretty crazy story, and it's one I'd actually never heard before.
Ooh, tell me everything. But first, are there any special warnings for this one?
There are, unfortunately. So this episode involves the death of a child. Again, sorry, everyone. And it also involves the death of a pet.
Of a pet? Oh, no.
I know. I think, all right, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're all here for human misery. I don't think anybody ever wants to hear about the abuse or death of animals. So I'm going to propose that henceforth with the podcast, let's not ever be specific. Let's just say a pet. And then you can imagine.
I totally agree. I don't want to talk about animal death ever. So let's say they lost their pet. Let's say they lost their pet mosquito.
Yes. Yes. Tragically, there is the death of a pet mosquito.
All right, I've got my vodka and Coke.
Well, I'm not drinking. I'm battling a migraine, so I'm a little high. Let's do this.
Perfect.
All right. Wakefield, Massachusetts is where this all takes place. And Wakefield is a charming town on a lake, about 12 miles or, and I looked this up for you, 19 kilometers from Boston.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So Hiram and Charlotte Badger were married in Wakefield in September of 1890. And at the time, she was 16 and he was 24.
Okay, so they're married and they're happy and they're living the best life outside of Boston.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so. But I think there were signs that maybe not everything was well with his mental health, because I found an article when I was researching this. I found an earlier article dated about 3 months before they were married on June 10th, 1890. Hiram's arrested and charged with the theft of a gold watch from a jewelry store. But at the arraignment, the store owner, a guy named Mr. Chadsey, testified in court that he was mistaken, and he now thought that Hiram meant to buy the watch on an installment plan, but instead put it in his pocket because that makes sense.
Okay, that does sound a bit odd. But you know what? I love how in these old-timey stories, people often try to not, cause a scandal and just come up with these great stories on the spot.
Yeah, right? And how many people, like, at this time and even forward, like, later found out their sister was really their mother? Like, so much unnecessary shame back then. I mean, listen, we still have a long way to go. Yeah, so I think this is the first red flag we see, and I think it's not even that he stole the watch. It's the fact that he claimed it was his watch and it had been stolen from him in Boston. But the case was dismissed because his employer at the time paid for the watch.
Okay, wow. I mean, it must have been a very valuable employee then. So, what do you think? Do you think it was his watch?
I don't think so. I mean, the thing is, everything I read, it seems like they weren't well off. They rented their house, they didn't own it, they didn't own property, and it seems like he actually had a lot of trouble keeping a steady job. I suspect this thing with the watch might have been the last straw with this particular employer because he was working as a shipper at one point, but then around this time you start to see him listed as a furniture repairman, and then he's described as doing odd jobs, mowing lawns, doing handyman work. So I don't think there's any chance it was actually his watch, but I think the bigger issue is, did he really think it was his watch?
Okay, so maybe he's kind of delusional or going through some stressful period.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think he seems delusional, paranoid, sometimes psychotic. We'll get more into that. There were a lot of stories once the news broke about this. Of course, people start telling stories. So in different articles, let's see, I found that the neighbors said he was increasingly quiet, always in a bad mood, often very angry. There's a story about how he once ran out of a skating rink where he was working, jumped into a carriage, and then drove the horses 10 miles into the country, and then walked home.
Yeah.
With no explanation, and he didn't know why he'd done it.
All right.
Yeah.
So we know he's kind of an oddball, and let's call it rather eccentric, but is there more?
Yeah, there's more.
Oh.
So there's always more. So much more. And it's all terrible. All right. So there's another story. Oh, I love this one. He's found in a provision store with a lantern in the middle of the night, but not attempting to steal anything. So again, he says he doesn't know why he broke in and he wasn't prosecuted, which fair enough. No harm, no foul, right? And then they also mentioned that when kids in the neighborhood would make fun of him, I read that they called him bunk, which I think means stupid. He goes into he went into a rage and threatened to kill them all. So they all went screaming and running away. But I really feel like in this case, those kids kind of had it coming.
I mean, sorry, but I can't even blame him for that one, to be honest.
Same. Kids are so cruel sometimes. It's awful. But this guy has real issues, right? So many issues. Like your parents have collected every single issue of National Geographic since 1973. Yeah. Like, it's bad. I don't know exactly when in the timeline these things happened, except for the arrest in the jewelry store, which was 3 months before they were married in 1890. And now we're in 1908, which is when the events that led me to do a podcast episode on this transpired. So I don't know in the timeline how often these things happened, but clearly it wasn't good, right? So it's 1908 now. They've got 3 kids. Their oldest son, Leslie, is 17 years old. He's a cadet on the training ship Enterprise, docked in Boston. And then they've got 2 daughters. Florence is 15 and Catherine is 8. And the 2 girls are living at home, and they are beautiful, beautiful girls. That's the family in 1908. But Hiram's behavior is getting it's getting worse. So it's erratic, paranoid, delusional, and he's constantly accusing his wife Charlotte of having an affair. So that's not good. No. The first sign of real trouble comes on Sunday, December 6th. On that Sunday afternoon, Charlotte is going into Boston to run some errands. So she gets on an electric car headed for Boston via Sullivan Square. Hiram follows her. He hides so she can't see him on the train. And then when they get to Sullivan Square, he sees her meet what's described as a, quote, slightly built man, a barber, who used to live in Wakefield but now lives in Cambridge. So
okay, hide, stop. What the fuck is a slightly built man? I mean, I've never heard that expression before. Does that mean he was like small or?
It does. Yeah. So slightly built means like a small frame. I would imagine it could just mean small frame, but I'm imagining both like on the shorter side and also slim. So fun-sized. Small. So she meets this barber, our fun-sized barber, and they enter one of the cars of a tunnel train that's about to pull out of the station. And Badger like sneaks along behind them and then jumps on board just as the doors are about to be closed. He then attacks this guy and he beats him up before the train reaches the next stop. Once they reach the station, this is crazy, the police board the train because there's been this fight, and Hiram wants them to arrest the man he just beat up. That's crazy. But the policeman refuses. He says it's a family matter and doesn't want to get involved. At North Station, Mrs. Badger and Mr. Badger, now this sounds like a children's book, and all the baby badgers, Mrs. Badger and Mr. Badger get off the train, and so does the man, but we don't know what happens after that.
Yeah, okay, that sounds pretty cuckoo, honestly. And one word, spying and following your spouse and trying to beat up somebody else is a big no-no, people. Don't do that.
Yeah, it's not good. It's bad. So now his behavior, it seems like it's been like a steady decline, but now it's kind of getting dangerous. We don't know what happened after that, but on Monday, December 7th, Charlotte is seen around by neighbors, as are the girls, Catherine and Florence, and then later that afternoon, Charlotte goes into Boston to run some errands. She later says that Hiram gave her $5 and kissed her goodbye, and that he knew that she was not planning to be home that night. She is going to stay the night in Boston with friends and return home the next afternoon.
Okay, and Hiram was okay with that?
Yeah, apparently so. I mean, I can't help wonder, did she just need a little bit of time away from him after that whole thing on the train, which happened the night before? I wonder whether she was afraid of him or whether she was fed up with him and just needed a little space, right? You'd need that, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Little time out.
Exactly. She's off in Boston on the 7th, and Hiram and the girls are home as usual. The next morning, December the 8th, 1908, at around 7:15 in the morning, Hiram goes to Taylor's hardware store and buys a .38 caliber revolver and a box of ammunition. Nothing about the purchase was out of the ordinary.
Hardware store. Right. Okay, where else would you buy your .38 caliber?
Yeah, welcome to America. Unpasteurized cheeses are heavily regulated, but guns are pretty easy to get. Yeah, we've got some problems in this country, but this isn't about our problems. This is about their problems. So back to the Badger family. So shortly before 11 a.m., Hiram Badger walks out of his house onto Main Street. Their house is right on Main Street. So he basically just walks out of his house onto Main Street, and he's screaming incoherently and waving a revolver around. Some men are across the street on the sidewalk, and they're talking. And they look over at him because, so the screaming. And he screams at them, "What are you gaping at?" and fires 2 shots at the men.
What?
Yeah. He then shoots into the gutter a few times, and the milkman sees him shooting into the gutter and asks what he's shooting at, which, okay. So then he starts firing at the milkman, who dives behind his wagon. As you do. People start running for cover, and he's basically shooting at every single thing that moves or everything he sees that looks like a person. He fires at the people running for cover. He fires a shot through the window of Eaton's grocery store, which actually hits the clerk, Fred Wheeler, in the leg.
Oh no, poor Fred.
Yeah, I know, but don't worry, he does recover. I wish that was the worst of the story. After he shot Fred in the leg, he actually tried to shoot him again, point blank, and still missed. So thank God. It's a terrible shot. So he just keeps moving, reloading, and screaming. I mean, the horror. It's ugh. So he fires shots into the restaurant, the jewelry store, the drugstore, and then he was again aiming for a clerk, but just narrowly missed. He fires shots into the provision store, and then finally he sees like a milliner's shop, a hat shop, and there's a wax mannequin in the window. And he starts firing at the wax mannequin, thinking it's a woman. He's so close, he knows he must have hit it, but it's not falling over. And so he freaks out in this rage when he realizes it's a mannequin and just throws the gun at the mannequin. Yeah, and carries on everyone's screaming through town. Yeah, he shot over 50 rounds.
I'm so sorry, but this guy really just cracks me up. I mean, he fires 50 shots. That means he has to reload, I think, 7 times.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the only thing he's able to hit beside poor Fred is a freaking wax mannequin.
I know.
I mean, that guy is a terrible shot.
The worst.
The worst is the guys in the street, they would rather ask him, good day to you, sir. What are those shooting at? Instead of jumping him.
I know. Well, I wonder if at first, do you think they thought he was trying to shoot a rat? I don't even know. Did people do that? Because why was everybody so calm about him firing shots into the gutter? I mean, unless it's, again, that whole thing like you were saying before, like the way they're just reporting it to keep decorum at the time. But I imagine everyone was just losing their shit completely because it's nuts. Finally, a couple of townspeople rush him when they realize he's out of ammunition. When he throws the gun through the window, they take him down. But it takes 6 men to hold him down, which is bonkers. Yeah. And at that point, he yells, "I have killed my wife and daughter, and I want to kill the man."
Oh.
Yeah. So that's a problem. But first they have to sort out Hiram. So the police are there, and they get him to the police station where they strap him to a plank to keep him from hurting himself, which is, that's a bummer. And then they transport him by ambulance. So now he's strapped to a stretcher, which is, I mean, I think we can both agree that I'd rather be strapped to a stretcher than a plank of wood. But yeah, so he's taken by ambulance to a padded cell in Cambridge because Wakefield isn't a big enough town to have. I mean, it's a beautiful little town, but it's not padded cell in the prison town. You know, it's not that level of size. So they have to take him to Cambridge. In the newspaper, it actually said, quote, "A liberal administration of quieting drugs helped greatly in handling him," end quote. So I love that. I don't know about you, but like I've also found a liberal amount of quieting drugs to be of a great help on occasion.
I mean, definitely, especially when you're babysitting.
You're watching too much Madeleine McCann. Like anyone trusts me with their children. Anyway, so the police, they get the medical examiner. Okay, now things get bad. The police get the medical examiner and the 2 local doctors, one of whom had just finished treating poor Fred Wheeler's leg. And they head over to the Badger residence. When they get to the house, the door is unlocked. So they go inside, and everything seems fine. Everything's in order. They see the remains of a meal for 3 people on the table: cold meat, beans, bread, and cocoa. And it's all laid out on a red tablecloth. Nothing's disturbed. Nothing was put away either, but maybe that's just because Charlotte was away. So they make their way upstairs, and it's here that they start to notice blood on the floor. Then this is where it gets bad. They enter a bedroom, and the blankets on the bed are pulled all the way up. And when they lower the blanket, they find the mutilated bodies of both of his daughters, Florence, aged 15, and Catherine, aged 8. Both had been brutally killed with an axe in their sleep. Their heads were mangled, and their throats were cut with an axe. So it's clear that neither of the doctors are needed, and neither is an autopsy. Florence's death was actually reported as being more vicious. They both died of blunt force trauma, but he used the sharp end of the axe on Florence, and she was almost decapitated. So that's bad. Initially, they actually thought that the older daughter, Florence, was Mrs. Badger, is what the authorities thought at first. But they pretty quickly realized that it was the 2 girls who shared that room.
Okay, so do you think that maybe Harry mistook Florence for his wife, Charlotte, in his frenzy? Because at this point, it seems like he totally lost it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but it could be that he thought that he had killed his wife and his daughter. That would actually explain the "I've killed my wife and daughter." That actually explains a lot.
Yeah, right. And it would also explain why Florence was attacked worse. It's like he wanted to punish his wife.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's awful. So the medical examiner estimated that the time of death was around 6 o'clock that morning based on the blood drying, how dry the blood in the room was. So hopefully that happened when they were asleep.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, it's bad either way, but I think it would make it a little bit easier if you think it happened while those poor girls were sleeping. It's still really bad.
It is really bad. And of course, this is fresh hell, so never underestimate the creepiness. Because as they look around the room, They are horrified to see that after murdering his daughters, Hiram then spent some time alone in the room with their bodies because painted on the wall in what is described as, quote, crude red lettering are the words, "at rest." And there are some attempts at like a decorative fancy scroll work around the words in either red paint or blood.
Wait,
Okay, what?
do you think it was indeed blood and the media just wanted to tone it down a little bit to not give their readers nightmares?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's what I was trying to figure out. I read accounts that it was red paint, and I read other accounts that it was blood. But even though blood is worse, red paint seems too bizarre a thing to have gotten out in a room that was already covered in blood. So
Well, thank God we don't care if you guys get nightmares.
I think some of them are here for the nightmares. You're welcome. But, based on Hiram's confession, and I think you're right, I think maybe he did think he killed his wife and daughter, but they also think that that's what's happened. So they're still trying to find Charlotte, and they search the house. And when they go down into the basement, they find an axe, and it's embedded in a chopping block. And it looked like it had been cleaned, but there was still, and this is awful, visible blood and long dark hair on it. And they also find in the yard the body of the family pet.
The mosquito.
Yes. Rest in pieces, mosquito. You are no more. Yeah, so it's bad, but there's still no sign of Mrs. Badger, and they have no idea where she is. The authorities immediately send word to their oldest child. That's their son, Leslie, and he's on the training ship Enterprise in Boston.
Ooh, I hope Captain Kirk let him go when he heard the news.
Well, he did.
Good.
So he rushes home because this is awful. So he rushes home, arriving around noon, and is completely devastated. He can only say that his father had been acting strangely lately. And Charlotte learns about the murders in about the worst way you can imagine. In the Boston Globe, she's quoted as saying, "I was in the stores shopping in the forenoon and had bought a new hat. When I came upon the street shortly after dinner time, I heard the newsboys crying out about a murder. I at first paid no attention to them, but I glanced up at a paper which a boy held before me, and I was at once horrified to see the pictures of my children. I grabbed the paper and was dazed by the horrible news. I at once started for my home. I boarded an electric car, and I cannot remember any more. I do not know how I managed to get home."
That is really a terrible way to learn about what just happened to your family. I mean, this poor woman.
I know. I feel so badly for her because I think that she married him very young, and I really think that it was just a slow but deep dive into mental illness for him, and I really think she went through hell with this guy. And when she speaks about him, she says, quote, "I know he was crazy. He has been acting queerly for weeks. Why, he went away a few weeks ago and remained away for 5 days. While he was away, he wrote me a letter and said that he was going to kill himself. He never threatened to kill me at that time, though he has intimated since he has been behaving like an insane man that he would kill me. I cannot see how it is such a terrible thing for me to remain in Boston overnight. But I can remain away from my home a week if I want to and be just as good as anybody else. I am just as good as anybody. It is nothing against my good name to say that I remained from my home overnight." End quote. And quite right, Charlotte.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you should definitely be able to be away for one night without your husband killing your kids and your pet mosquito.
Yeah, no, seriously, though. I mean, it's the way every single article that I read, she is constantly having to defend herself. Every article kind of blames her. So, like, there's example after example, but this is one such example. So again, from the Globe, quote, "After that episode," and they're talking about the episode where Badger beat the guy up on a train after following her. "After that episode, Badger thought he had no recourse except to deal out justice in his own way according to his own views. Every moment he was in the house, he used to denounce his wife and endeavor to make her promise not to attempt to see the man in question again. The wife is understood to have been defiant and unwilling to comply with any of her husband's stern requests." End quote. She's always at fault.
That's really awful, really horrible. But you know what? Unfortunately, I think that's a common theme in many stories.
I know. Especially the old-timey ones where, I mean, she couldn't legally vote when any of this happened. It's easy to scapegoat the women, isn't it? So on December 11th, 3 days after the murder, there's a small private service held for the girls, and they're laid to rest on the cemetery in Wakefield, which overlooks the lake. It's actually a really beautiful part of the town. And also, there's an indictment, and on that day, they decide that they need to examine him to see if he is insane or not. And so on December 15th, 1908, Hiram is found to be insane. I've got another article to quote for you because I don't know, I like this. I like some of these old-timey articles. I kind of enjoy the way they're phrased. They're not always the easiest to read out loud, though, because we don't speak this way anymore. So this is from the Boston Globe, December 15th, 1908. Quote, Hiram L. Badger, who murdered his 2 children in Wakefield, was today committed to the State Insane Asylum for criminals at Bridgewater until further orders of the Superior Court. The commitment was signed today by Judge Bond, who this morning received the report of Dr. Edward R. Utley and Dr. George F. Jelly, the 2 alienists appointed to examine Badger. The report is as follows. To the Honorable Justices of the Superior Court, in compliance with the request of the Court, we have made 2 long examinations occupying several hours on December 13 and 14 of Hiram L. Badger, under indictment for murder of his 2 children, Florence and Catherine. We have questioned him in regard to his past life and habit, have endeavored to learn all of the circumstances attending the murder of his children, which he freely admits. We ascertained from him that several hours prior to the homicide, he was in great mental distress, unable to sleep, also contemplated bodily harm to the one whom he believed was breaking up his home. So great were his sufferings that they led to the homicidal acts, which were beyond his control. During one examination, he exhibited much grief and excitement, conveying to us the impression that at any time he might commit suicide. As a result of our examination, we are clearly of the opinion that he has never been of a strong intellect, and that at the time of the homicide, he was insane and is insane now. End quote. Yeah.
This quote sounds like, again, they were like excusing his behavior and kind of a little bit blaming her, right?
Because he was to the person that he thought was breaking up his marriage. I actually don't know if he means they're his wife or this barber guy, but he wanted to kill both, it seems like, on the day. So he is found insane, which clearly, and he's committed to, as you know, the quote said, the insane asylum at Bridgewater, which is actually still there. But if you're thinking that he got off easy because he went to a psychiatric hospital and not to prison, don't, because it was bad. This is the hospital that was featured in a documentary called The Tittycut Follies. It was made in 1967. It was called Tittycut Follies after a show that the inmates would put on, but it was horrifying. It showed naked patients being abused and neglected, and this was in the late 60s. You know, things in the insane asylum were better like 60 years before that film was made.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you ever saw the Geraldo Rivera story about Willowbrook, but that's how I would imagine every asylum in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
I mean, or even worse, no?
Exactly. Yeah, it's awful. It's very American Horror Story Asylum.
Yeah.
It's same thing as Willowbrook. And actually, I thought this was interesting because this all came up when I was researching. The state of Massachusetts, when this film came out, it came out before Willowbrook, but not as many people have seen it because the state of Massachusetts sued to keep it from being released to the public. And they won. And it was the first known instance in American history of a film being banned. This is a quote, film being banned from general distribution for reasons other than obscenity, immorality, or national security. That's crazy.
I think another huge problem is that, you know, treatment was still in its infancy.
It was. Yeah, you're right. So the first antipsychotic drug was chlorpromazine, and that didn't become available until the 1950s. So before that, in Hiram's time, there would have been opium and morphine, but of course they both have side effects and risk addiction. They also used mercury to control mania, but that would also kill you on its own. And then they used barbiturates to knock people out, which they thought would help improve madness. Kind of the irony of all of this is, I think, and again, not a doctor, but it sounds pretty like classic schizophrenia symptoms, this poor man. So if we can kind of just look at from that aspect of things, the irony is schizophrenia, as we know it today, was coined by Eugen Bleuler, I think is how you pronounce his name, that year in 1908, in that spring. The hardest thing, though, with a lot of mental illness and schizophrenia in particular is getting someone to actually realize that they're unwell, because it seems like Hiram had delusions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because he believed things that weren't happening and he had paranoia, obviously. If you can actually recognize today that this is a problem you have and you can get treatment, you can live a very productive, happy life, right? If you get on meds. But back then, there was nothing. He had no chance at all. But equally, most people with schizophrenia are never going to harm anybody. Like, they're more likely to be the victim of a crime than to harm anyone. So I think this guy was not a great guy who then also happened to get schizophrenia, right? Because there's a difference.
So actually, one thing I would like to know is, do we know what happened to Charlotte afterwards?
We do, a little bit. On January 20th, 1915, Charlotte was granted a divorce. So that's 7 years after the murders. And it looks like she bothered to get the divorce because she had met a really lovely man. And she went on to live, I think, a happy life. I mean, I'm sure that she thought about those girls every single day, as did their brother. I mean, it's an awful, awful thing to survive, especially when another family member is responsible for a loss like that.
Makes everything a little bit worse, if that's even possible. I'm sure she blamed herself to some degree, even if she wasn't to blame at all.
Yeah, exactly. It was all just really, really awful. And people made her feel bad about it, and I know that she felt bad about it.
Well, people love some good victim blaming. Do we know what happened to Hiram actually later on?
Yeah, so Hiram dies in the asylum in 1943, and he is age 78. Yeah, see, Charlotte dies in 1966 at the age of 92, and I'm hoping she was surrounded by family and then got to see her daughters again. And that is the murder of Catherine and Florence Badger.
Wow, that was very intense. Thanks, Annie. It was awesome. Scary, terrible, but awesome. And you know what? What makes it so sad? I think all of this could have been probably be avoided if they would have had the access to modern diagnostic therapy and medication, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, like we were saying before. Today, fortunately, if you need help, there's help out there. But back then, it was awful. It was awful. It's all awful. Everything is terrible. But that's what we come here for. So thanks very much for listening. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. That really helps us out a lot. Please tell your friends about us. And tune in next week for another episode of the Fresh Hell Podcast.
Oh, and guys, don't forget we're going to post all the photos on our Instagram and Facebook.
Please remember, if you're going through hell,
keep on going.
Bye.
Tschüss.
Gesundheit.